Okay, cool. So we're recording now. We're live for this event. So thanks everyone for joining again. Obviously, we're still on virtual meetings at the moment, and will be for the foreseeable. It looks like with on Taoiseach still to let us out of the house. But I think we'll mix it up, hopefully a wee bit towards the end of the year if we can. So again, another really good speaker, good friend of the meetup as well. Brendan was involved. We just discussed him actually a few minutes ago on the first meetup we had as TestHeads, going back to January 2019. So just over 2.5 years away. So you're probably overdue a welcome back, Brendan, at this stage. So if it's okay, I'll just leave Brendan just give a brief intro on himself, and he'll crack in the talk. Again, as ever, any kind of questions you have, we'll have plenty of time at the end for questions. So feel free to jot them down or put them in the chat box if you like to keep account of them during the talk, and we'll give everyone a chance to crack away at the end. But over to you, Brendan. Enjoy that.
Okay, thanks, Paddy. So yeah, just a quick introduction about myself. So my name is Brendan Donegan. Obviously, I'm a staff engineer at HMH, where I've been for 3 years now. So as Paddy mentioned, about 2 years ago, we had the first TestHeads meetup there, and I did a talk about our kind of evolution in terms of testing up to that point. And I've been a quality engineer for about 15 years now, so mainly working kind of the area of test automation. So, run into a lot of different tools, and Pact is an interesting one. So basically, just to set the context for the talk, I'll just give a bit of a summary now. So I've basically broken it down into 4 bits. So the first part is basically, why do you want faster, more frequent deployments? So a bit of background about that. The second part is going to be about the current reality in terms of what the challenges teams are facing in terms of being able to do this. And then the next part is going to be about Pact itself and how that works. And then finally, we'll talk a little bit about how we've been using Pact in HMH, some of the challenges and also some of the benefits we've seen as well from using it. Okay, so so in terms of why you want to do more and faster deployments, so there's a very good book called Accelerate out there, which basically talks about what are the characteristics of high performing organizations, what characteristics do they share, and basically what they find is that these 2 characteristics here, so faster time from commit to deploy and more frequent deployments, basically leads to a lower change failure rate and the ability to restore service much faster. So the idea is that if you are able to iterate more quickly on changes, then those changes tend to fail less. So the risk comes from bundling a lot of changes into big kind of deployments, and then you end up facing issues, and it takes a long time to actually work through those issues and have a acceptable release, basically. And one thing that's surprising as well that they mentioned is that only about 20% of companies currently fit this description. So there's still a long way for the industry to go in terms of being able to actually achieve these things across the board. So the current reality a lot of us work in, a lot of us are working on systems that are microservices based, or at least, follow a service oriented architecture. So, you have one or more front end clients. You might have a website, you might have a mobile app, and then multiple backend services. So you have your API layer basically, and you have your API layer that your UI talks to, and you also have, interactions between those different constituent components of the API layer. So, microservice A might talk to microservice B, which might talk to microservice C, and and so on. We also usually have at least one pre-production environment. So the idea is usually that, a developer makes a change, you put those changes onto staging before they go into production, and you essentially use that as kind of an integration ground for making sure that all of your different pieces can talk to each other successfully. So essentially you're kind of deploying a change there, and you're making sure that it still works in the context of your whole application. Okay, so yeah, and this diagram kind of illustrates it there. So, you know, a couple of different clients using different technologies in terms of, you know, what the client is actually written in. And the same for the backend services. So there's an API gateway, and then you have different microservices which talk to each other. So, you know, your UI might not be talking directly to microservice C, but microservice B is talking to it. So there's a lot of different interactions going on there, and they might all be written in different technologies as well. So, you know, Java, Ruby, .NET. This is something that, you know, we have in HMH is, you know, we have maybe 3 or 4 different languages that our backend services are written in. You know, we use Java, we use .NET, we use Node, we use Scala as well. And typically, in terms of deploying changes to these backend services, the deployments are kind of decoupled from each other. So you don't typically have a situation where it's like, oh, you know, you want to make a change to production, so you deploy all of the current versions of your services onto the staging environment. You do this, you know, the whole point of a microservices architecture is that you're able to do this individually. So you're able to deploy microservice A separately from microservice B and microservice C, to give you that flexibility in terms of, you know, if you have a particular issue, you can just deploy a change in the one service that is actually affected. So each part can deploy separately. And then what will typically happen is after one of these components is deployed to the staging environment, we won't find out about issues with that until someone figures out that, you know, they have a problem and it was that particular service that broke their application. So, you know, you'll deploy a particular version of the service to environment. You might run some tests against that, but, you know, maybe the tests don't catch the issue. You wait a few hours to make sure that, or maybe even days to make sure that that change is okay. At some point in that day, somebody comes along and says, oh, you know, this thing is not working anymore. Is it possibly your service that's broken it? And then you have to go and debug and figure out what exactly is going on. And it takes a long time and a lot of back and forth communication to do that. Yeah, so essentially the big issues with that, you know, so these deployments are slow and risky if you want to do any changes. So if you want to make a change, or if you have to make a change to a data contract, then you know, you can't just deploy straight onto production without any intermediate testing in staging, because the risk is too large to do that. You don't have enough information to know that your clients are still going to work in that context. So what will typically happen is you'll have to sort of know about who all your clients are. You'll need to inform that you're going to do the update, and then you'll have to deploy together in lockstep. So, you know, you'll have to deploy a change to the staging environment. The client will deploy a change to the staging environment, and then you'll deploy together to production to make sure that there's as little downtime as possible for your users. So this leads to a case where teams really avoid doing these changes, or if they really have to, they do them very infrequently. And it means that, you know, everything is just a lot slower. So this is the part where Pact comes in. So Pact is what's referred to as a consumer-driven contract testing framework, and, you know, it's actually one of the few examples out there at the moment. So just to kind of split this out into the 2 parts. So contract testing is basically the idea that you test purely the data contract between your different components. So between a consumer of data and the provider of that data. And then the term consumer driven refers to the fact that it's the consumer, which is the thing that is actually receiving the data and using it, that should determine what is required, right? So the idea is that, you know, traditionally what you would do is, you know, you would kind of create an API in advance, which you think is going to satisfy all of your consumers' needs. But really, wouldn't it be better if you have the consumers define what they need and then build the API around that? Okay, so that's kind of what that refers to. So it works on four main principles or parts. So there's the idea of the consumer, the idea of a provider, there's the idea of a contract between both of those, and then there's also the idea of a broker, which I'll explain. I'll explain all of these in the next slides. So what is a consumer in Pact? So a consumer is something that sends requests to a provider and uses the response that's returned. So there's a lot of different protocols out there used to do this, but the one that's probably most familiar with the most people here is the basic, HTTP REST JSON protocol. So, you send a HTTP request, you get back a JSON response, and then you do something with that. So next, what is a provider in Pact? So the provider on the other side of the equation is something that receives these requests and sends the response back. And it's important to point out as well that one piece of software can be both a consumer and a provider in this model. So you can have one microservice, for example, which needs to consume data from another microservice, but it also is providing data to, say, your UI or a third microservice. And that's, it's perfectly allowable within this model. That's a individual component can do both of these things. So what is a contract then? So a contract is basically the set of interactions between a consumer and a provider. And what I mean by an interaction is it's basically a pair of requests and responses. So, for a particular request that you make, you get a particular response. And it's important to point out as well that this is a little bit different from, say, an endpoint in REST. So for example, you can have one endpoint, but maybe that endpoint takes different parameters or different headers that make it behave differently and return a different response. And that's essentially a different interaction then. So, if you have an endpoint that, returns, let's say, I can't think of an example right now, but that's essentially the idea. And then the broker, fourth part, is something that essentially acts as a middleman between the consumers and the providers and maintains information about the contract. So it stores the contracts and allows the consumers and the providers to access those contracts. And this is just an example of the kind of thing that the broker stores. So it basically stores contracts with versions, so version contracts, and also the results of those verifications. So, let's say, one version isn't valid because there's some mismatch between what the provider provides and the consumer expects. But then maybe another version is verified successfully. It's going to store all that information. And it'll store this for all, various consumer and provider pairs. So, it'll store all of that. So in general, the workflow for setting up a provider for Pact is essentially what you do is you have a test harness, which basically retrieves the contracts from the broker and replays the interactions defined in those contracts against your actual provider software. And you run those tests usually as part of your CI, so your integration or unit tests. And then after you run those tests, you publish the results to the Pact broker. And this allows you to kind of know whether a particular version of the provider works with a particular version of the consumer. And then another thing that you can do as well is when you release a new version of the provider to a particular environment, you can also tag it with that environment. So later on, your consumer can kind of know which version of the provider is running on a particular environment, so it can check that it's compatible with it. And broadly, it's the same for a consumer as well. So you essentially, when you're developing your consumer, you write tests for any code that makes a request to an API. You run those tests as part of your CI, publish the results to the Pact broker, and then you also tag when you deploy to a particular environment. And this is just basically a high-level summary of all that kind of hooked together. So on the consumer side, you have tests which they test against a provider mock, and the interactions are captured into a contract and then published to a broker. And then on the provider side, it retrieves those contracts and runs a test against a mocked version of itself. Yep. So now I'll go into basically how a consumer test basically works. So there's pretty wide language support out there for consumer testing as well. So it supports JVM, JavaScript, .NET, Python, Go, Ruby, and I think it's about maybe 10 or 15 other languages. So pretty much any language you can think of, they've got some level of support out there for it. But they basically all kind of wrap the same process essentially. So the idea is in a consumer test, what happens is you, in your test, you start a mock server locally. So you're not testing against the real provider itself. You're testing against a mocked version that you set up. So you start that locally, and then you tell it which requests to expect and what kind of response it should receive. And then you run your client code against it and check that the expected response was actually received. And what this does basically is it generates that contract as a side effect of doing that. And the intention is that these tests usually replace unit tests for code that uses APIs. So any code that kind of implements an API call on your client is, you know, instead of unit testing that, you write a Pact test for it instead. Okay. And this is an example of an interaction here. So, you know, it's literally just, you know, make a request an endpoint, and then you get a certain response back. And one thing to highlight here as well is that Pact has this support for a concept called matchers. So let's say that you have an endpoint that returns a list of pets, for example. It would be inconvenient if each item had to be the same. So instead of saying that we, you know, expect particular objects to be returned, we can say we expect objects like this one to be returned. So as long as all fields have the same type as specified and all the fields are kind of found in the response, then it's going to be successful. The verification is going to be successful. Another concept that Pact supports, which is quite important, is the idea of provider states. So if you think about that particular interaction that we just described there, that requires certain prerequisites to be in place before that interaction can actually be tested. So you need to have some pets in your pet database in order for pets to be returned by your API. So basically what provider states allow is they allow you to set up data in your provider to tell you what conditions need to be satisfied for the interaction to succeed. So in the previous example, we would say the state is something like a pet has been added to the database, you know, or some language like that. And then what you can do is the provider verification framework allows you to write state handler code, which ensures that these conditions are true. So if you think about, you know, if you have a backend service, which, you know, it's got an integration test framework, you can basically add data to the database, and then something will be returned when you make that API request. And then afterwards, you can clean up your database as well. It's similar to what you would do in integration tests. And then the last kind of concept that is important to highlight is the idea of provider verification hooks. So essentially, what the broker facilitates is the idea that you can have webhooks set up so that when a change is made to your contract, you can actually call your CI provider to run the verification. And that allows you to kind of decouple the verification from the different CIs. So in your consumer CI, you don't necessarily have to run the provider verification inside the consumer CI. You can just trigger it from the broker, and allows you to decouple it a bit. And yeah, just to kind of get a better idea of, you know, how things might break when you're working with Pact tests. You know, what are some of the different ways in which they can fail. So on the consumer side, what can happen is, let's say, for example, your client code changes, but your test doesn't change, and it sends it to a different endpoint. So let's say instead of sending to the pets endpoint, it sends to an animals endpoint instead. What's going to happen in that case is that the Pact mock server is going to reject your request. It's going to say, I haven't received the request that I expected to receive. And then when that fails, you'll look at, you know, is that something that I intended to change, or is it, you know, should it be something else? The other possibility is that you could change the request body, for example, and the same thing would happen there. So the purpose of this is to make sure that what your client is actually sending matches a contract. And we actually had a case of this going wrong actually this week in our test. So essentially the way that the Pact test was written, so the Pact test was sending a request that wasn't the one that was actually the one that the client was sending. So the Pact test was passing in the provider CI, even though a completely different request was actually being sent by the client code. It's very important to make sure that you're actually using your client functions in your Pact consumer tests. And then on the provider side, what would happen in the last scenario? So let's say that we changed the URL deliberately. So we changed it to animals, and we also updated the test so that that passed. What would happen then is that that test would run against the provider, and a 404 would be returned because the provider doesn't support that route. So this is kind of to illustrate the fact that this verification takes place not only on the consumer side, but also on the provider side, and both have to be valid in order for the Pact test to be correct. So, you know, just because your Pact test does pass on the consumer side, it doesn't mean it's going to pass on the provider side, because your provider might not support that particular route. And then the same thing can happen with removing or renaming fields in the provider. So let's say you update your provider code and it's no longer returning the species field from that endpoint. That's also going to fail because your interaction is expecting that that field will be present. So yeah, as I mentioned as well, I'd talk a little bit about how we've been using Pact at HMH and how that's kind of gone over the past year or so. So, you know, in the past kind of 2 years, so after the talk that I did at the first TestHeads, end-to-end tests have been identified, you know, as a significant bottleneck in our development processes. So, you know, as the product's gotten bigger and bigger and bigger, we've ended up with more and more and more end-to-end tests. And, you know, it's led to very long deployment times. They're not still fast-ish, you know, so we're usually able to make about 1 or 2 deployments a day, which is reasonably good. But the team spend a lot of time basically debugging, triaging these end-to-end tests. And that, you know, that's time taken away from actually doing development. So we started rolling out Pact at the beginning of last year, after it had kind of been trialed and POC'd in various teams, but not really rolled out for quite a while before that. So we put a policy in place where new code in the UI, which called APIs, was required to have Pact tests. And we also worked with some of the backend service teams to set up the provider side verification. And that's grown, you know, over the past year or so. And I think we probably have about maybe 60 or 70% coverage of Pact tests at the moment in terms of providers enabled. So some of the lessons learned as well in using Pact and HMH. So the whole idea of contract testing and consumer-driven contracts in general is very new. So it's not something that a lot of people are familiar with. And this model, it needs quite a lot of explaining. So the first recommendation I'd make to anyone who wants to adopt this is that you allow plenty of time for basically educating teams on exactly how Pact works. So, you need somebody who's going to go in and really like get to know it in depth and then spread that knowledge out to the different teams. And there also needs to be capacity for teams to do that learning as well. That's kind of one of the challenges that we've faced is, trying to roll this out at the same time as, developing new products. It's challenging to get that time in to make sure that everyone understands it completely. And because it's new, it's not like something like, unit testing or integration testing where you can go hire people who actually know about it. Most people are not going to be already aware of what contract testing is and how it works before they come into your organization. The other thing that we learned as well that kind of tripped us up is that so in Pact, there's actually different versions of the specification, and different language support frameworks have different functionality. And this is something that's getting better over time, but it's not something that's completely fixed yet. So say, for example, you have a provider that is written in Java and you have a consumer that's written in JavaScript. You can't use, so even though the JVM provider framework supports version 3 of the Pact framework, which allows particular functionality to be used, the JavaScript framework, which is version 2, doesn't support that. So specifically, one of the challenges that we've run into is if you have, let's say you have a particular endpoint that requires a unique ID to be passed in the URL, what you would have to do is you would have to have a state handler which creates an object which has that, which has a particular UID or particular ID, and then it has to be able to basically fill in the value in the request. So it has to create an object and then it has to dynamically fill in that value. That's a piece of functionality that isn't in version 2. So that's not something that we're able to test at the moment. And unfortunately, a lot of our backend services actually require that. So they don't allow IDs to be passed in the body of the test or of the request even. They have to be passed in the path, and that makes it a lot more difficult. Another thing is that it's a lot easier to follow if your providers are set up to allow easy creation of test data. So what I mean by that is sometimes a particular backend service might be written so that it's quite difficult to set up test data. You have to basically use the provider's own APIs to create test data rather than just being able to populate the database. And that makes it a lot more challenging to set things up in Pact. And then the last recommendation as well, and this kind of ties into the education part, is you have to build your pipelines very carefully to make sure that failures are caught early. So one of the mistakes we made as well is, checking the Pact verification too late in the process, and allowing developers to merge code that was broken and then finding out about it later on, and that leads to a lot of frustration. People want to know, why am I only finding out about this now when it could have been caught earlier in my CI? So that's something that you need to take account of. But in terms of the results and benefits, so it's allowed us to basically drastically reduce our level of end-to-end testing. So, going from a pipeline that was kind of 4 hours minimum to run with all of the tests and all the triage that had to be done, to one that takes just over an hour to go from a developer's machine to production. That's a huge increase, and we couldn't really follow this strategy without using Pact. And then a nice little side effect we found as well is that the Pact broker serves as a kind of an easily browsable repository of APIs that have already been implemented. So especially when you're working on a very, very large project, what will often happen is, a particular developer will need a particular endpoint to do something with their application, and it'll be very hard to figure out if that endpoint has already been implemented in the code. And what the Pact broker allows you to do is it allows you to see more easily what interactions are already available and what endpoints are already implemented. So in the future, so there's, in terms of the future for Pact and also the future for Pact and HMH, so Pact itself is getting a lot more powerful. There's some pretty exciting new features coming. One of these is support for Open API specification version 3. And the whole idea of version of that is it's basically it's Swagger essentially, but the idea is that it's you declare your API in such a way that that Swagger document is essentially your actual interface. So if your Swagger document says that your service is going to return a particular response in a particular format, it actually is. It's not like there can't be any mismatch between the two, basically. So essentially your interfaces or your Swagger documentation is generated from your interface and vice versa. And then the other thing as well that they're talking about doing is auto-generating consumer contracts from other mocking frameworks. So, there's a lot of other mock frameworks out there that you can use for mocking APIs. And there's an acknowledgement that Pact is sort of kind of doing the same thing in terms of its, to write those tests, you have to mock endpoints. So rather than having to do that and it being slightly redundant, you can just use another framework to generate your Pact tests. And in terms of HMH, so the more we roll out Pact across HMH, the more we'll be able to achieve those benefits that I talked about earlier. So right now, not all of our providers and consumers are enabled for Pact. So it means that there's still a lot of services out there that still have to follow the old model of kind of deploying to an integration environment, waiting, and then, actually not really knowing whether or not they've broken someone until someone else maybe runs tests. So the more that we kind of spread this out, the more it's going to allow us to achieve those benefits. And then just the last few resources here. So there's some links there. So there's a lot of documentation. It's very, very well documented project. So that's their main website. And then also, just to highlight as well, so for the broker part, they have an open source broker that you can deploy on your own infrastructure. But they also have they offer a service, a hosted service to do that as well, called PactFlow. And here's a link to just their developer documentation. And then finally, they also have a Slack channel, and all the maintainers hang out there and a lot of other people, including myself. So if anyone has any questions or wants to know more, you can definitely jump on there after taking a look at the documentation. And that's it really. And now we can move on to questions. So I'll just take a look in the chat. Stop sharing.
Cool, good stuff. Thanks, Brendan. That was very interesting. There's a lot of questions actually coming through there already, which is always a good sign. I'm gonna just call them out if that's okay, just so they get picked up for the recording. Otherwise, the chat log never.
Oh, cool, yeah.
That's okay. So our pal Vic, who's usually the first person with a question, you love a Vic every single month. Can the solution work with gRPC? Can the solution work with bidirectional streaming?
As far as I know,
I think Dara might have answered that as well, actually.
Yeah. Protobuf. Yeah. Yeah. It's experimental. Okay. Yeah. Like I said, there's a lot of different protocols out there. They're mainly focused on REST, but there's message passing as well that they support.
Cool, Grant. Enda Brody's asked, can you recommend any Pact examples that handle API gateways?
No, but that would be, if you can want to jump on the Slack channel, that's something I'm sure that they'd be happy to help with. Let me see. It's okay.
Okay, cool. Grant, I'll share the link with that after as well if needs be. Sasha's asked 2 questions. First one, do you normally put the contract test into each service repo or into some QA test repo? And the second part, in the web gateway service scenario, would you test just web gateway bit?
So to answer the first question, we normally put them in the same. So essentially, like I said, they're like unit tests or integration tests. So you would normally put them with the actual code that's actually making the calls. So the risk there would be that if you're not doing that, then essentially you might be testing something different than you're actually, using in the real application. So that's what we do at the moment, is we put them in the actual service repos or the UI repo. So in the web gateway service scenario, would you just test web gateway bit? So I think, just to clarify that diagram a little bit, I think what they mean in there by the API gateway, because that's actually a diagram I took from them. I think they're referring to just the API gateway layer is essentially the bit that kind of manages the API calls going through. So they'll do things like load balancing and stuff like that. So it's not actually a specific piece of software that you need to test,
Okay, cool. Grant, our pal Carol over in Texas is asking, how are you measuring coverage for providers, the number of providers with CDCT written? And also, did you face any resistance to this methodology? If so, have you got any tips for overcoming the resistance?
So yeah, so just to highlight, there's kind of 2 ways of measuring coverage essentially, right? So if you're talking about coverage in terms of like the number of endpoints that, or number of interactions even, that are actually tested fully in Pact, that's one thing. But then, we're also, what I was referring to specifically was like, the number of providers that are actually enabled for Pact that we, are using for our UI. So we might be using, like, let's say, a dozen different backend services in our UI, and we've got like 8 of them enabled so far, and there's 4 more to go. So in terms of the other questions, so resistance to the methodology, yeah, definitely we have faced a certain level of resistance. So there's, like I said, it's a very new concept, and it can be a bit tricky for people to understand. And I think, usually what people kind of end up highlighting or trying to focus on a bit is, how is it really different from my backend API's own integration tests, or how is it different from Swagger or something like that? And what the Pact maintainers say is that, it's different because those are not, like, when you're testing your API with its own tests, those have no relation at all to what the consumer code is actually doing. So you could be testing one thing and then the consumer is doing something completely different. It's sending different requests, it's expecting different responses. You don't actually, even though it's testing something similar in terms of it's testing the data contract, it's not testing it from the point of view of the consumer. And then for the Swagger thing, Swagger is kind of the schema there, but it's not actually testing the interactions essentially. So just because Swagger says, that a particular endpoint is going to return a particular response, it doesn't necessarily mean that, that's actually what your consumer needs. Although some of the stuff I talked about there at the end is hoping to kind of address this a little bit, from the point of view of using Open API spec version 3.
Okay, cool. Thanks for that. Anyone else has any questions? Last call. We can take 1 or 2 more. If anyone else has anything else to put in the chat box, feel free to fire it up or stick your hand up. We can bring you into the call. Going once, twice. Sold. Okay, cool. Grant, so that's about us done. Brendan, thanks a million for that. That was something different and something interesting. A few good new people on the call as well, which is always good. So again, the new topic is always always of interest to people. For anyone who thinks that they have friends or colleagues, something who might benefit from this kind of talk as well, we'll share the recording tomorrow and share some of the information that Brendan's mentioned there as well in the email. It'll be posted up on the YouTube channel and LinkedIn and everything tomorrow, so plenty of ways to view it. And we'll be back at the end of next month, which will be May, and we'll probably be sitting right here again with restrictions. But again, we have a few other ideas. Usual call for action. Don't have to put your hand up to speak, but if anyone has any topics or anything else they want to hear about for the rest of the year, please do let us know, and we can try and put it in place. We have a couple of guys and a couple of people that are looking to speak towards the summertime as well, which is great. But even now, kind of looking towards the end of the year for topics and stuff as well. So again, is that you don't have to put your hand up to speak if you don't feel comfortable. If you do, great. It's a good place to start. And Brendan, Dara, anyone who talks will tell you it's relatively easy and welcoming when you're speaking to your computer screen. But if you do have topics or anything that's of interest to you or where you're working and you're struggling, feel free to get in touch with Dara and we'll go and find someone. As you've seen over the last year or so, we've been able to access not only quality people like Brendan who are local, but also a lot of people from the UK, Scotland, the States, all around as well. So it does give us a good access point to get other speakers in for topics where we might not have the actual reach here in Dublin. So feel free to put your hand up, anything else. Dar, anything else?
Oh, that's everything. I think, Bren, thanks so much again. It's great seeing you again, by the way. And I think is Dara in here as well? Hey, Dara.
Yeah.
Dara's here, yeah. Dara, I can see Dara there as well. Yeah, Graham, we won't leave it 2.5 years so Brendan to pick you up again, okay?
No, I'm not
planning to. We'll push you a bit sooner. There's a few other people in this call as well, actually. I'll be messaging tomorrow to put their hand up as well. There's a few guys that want to speak as well. So we'll you know who you are. I'll be talking to you tomorrow. Okay. Okay, great. Stay safe, everyone. Take care, okay? Bye now.
Bye-bye.